Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mineral Rights Podcast. I am your host, Matt Sands, and with me today is Justin Williams. Hello, Justin.
Hello, Matt. Thanks for having me, as always.
Thanks for being on the show. And today we're going to talk about the life cycle of an oil and gas well. And be sure to listen to the end because we'll talk about the timeline and when you should expect to start receiving royalty checks. If you hear that there is a well being drilled on your property, this is some information you can use to sort of guesstimate when you should expect to start getting royalties. So before we get started, just a reminder that you can find the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com. Any feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com, or you can leave a comment there, or there's a phone number where you can leave a voicemail. So Justin, before we get going, do you have any active permits on minerals that your family owns?
Absolutely. So in one of the tracts that we receive overriding royalties, they have several permits, and those were a couple years ago. And I know I get questions about this from mineral right owners quite often. And it's just, you come from inside the industry, but from the outside looking in, it's hard to understand everything that they're going through and everything it takes to get that oil well producing.
Yeah, and there's a lot of steps, and we'll go through those from the beginning, from when before the well is drilled to actually the steps involved to drill and complete the well, and then afterwards in the time frames associated with each. Just, and again, these are sort of typical time frames. Your mileage may vary depending on the complexity of the geology in your area, the depth of the well, the length of the well, things like that. But just to say that these sort of are general steps that you could apply to most unconventional oil and gas wells that are being drilled today. So get started before the well is drilled. So we'll talk about sort of the high level planning that goes into selecting locations and so forth. And what they do is they put together what's just like any business. They have a business plan, and that business plan will outline the capital expenditures. In other words, the investment they're going to make over the next several years. And what'll happen after that is, after they get their budget, geologists and engineers will work together to determine where they want to drill the wells. And so what they'll do is look at the geology, look at the reservoir properties, and try to pick the best locations within the acreage that the company has. And from there, look at what the estimated reserves are. And so there's a whole nother episode we could go on estimating reserves and all of that. But just to say that they go through some engineering calculations to figure out the volume of oil and gas that they think is present and how much can be extracted by each well. That goes into, along with the estimates from each of the engineers, as to how much it's going to cost to build the facilities, to build the well pad, to drill the well, to complete it, to build any infrastructure like pipelines or compressor stations. And all that together will go into that cost estimate. And then reservoir engineer will typically run economic evaluation on each of those proposed locations, and then prioritize from top to bottom, where the most profitable wells first, and then to the least profitable. And then that's how they select where they're going to go and drill. And obviously there's some other considerations they have to take into account, like assuming they have, title clearances and they have actually the leases in place. They have a surface use agreement in place, and they've selected a well pad location that's suitable in that area, and it's got access to existing pipelines, and or the pipelines that are there have capacity for these new wells to come online. So those are some of the things at the high level that they look at in picking the wells. And so that's kind of the first step. So the next step is they do the more detailed design. That's where they bring all the groups together that are need to have input into the well pad design and location and the size and things like that. And so they'll look at where the road should enter and or exit the pad, so that trucks can enter and leave and have enough room to move around. And they look at where they're going to place the surface facilities, where they're going to place the wellheads and so forth. And once they land that design, then what they can do is and then go and build it. So when they get the surface approvals and all that stuff, they'll go in and start to look at how they are going to build the road in there. And then there's a couple, like two parallel paths that sort of occur, once they start to move dirt. So there's the building the well pad and the actual drilling of the wells, which I'll talk about. And then kind of parallel to that, they have to build the gathering pipelines or tie into existing pipelines so that they can actually move the oil and gas off the pad once and sell it once they start producing. So in parallel, so just think about this, these things are going on at the same time, but generally, in an ideal situation, you won't have a delay for, then tying in pipelines and building that other infrastructure. Sometimes you could get into that situation just depending on individual cases, but just in general, we'll say if everything's done really well and efficiently, the actual work in the field of building the pad and drilling the wells will be kind of on the critical path, so to speak. So once they've got that surface use agreement in place with the surface landowner, they've got permits in place from the state agencies, they can go in and start to move dirt and build that well pad. So they'll actually grade and level the well pad itself, install what's called a surface conductor. And that's a piece of pipe that they place into the ground where each of the wells is going to go. And that's sort of to help them start the drilling operations and provide stability for that surface wellbore. And then, depending on how much earthwork they have and how long the road is that they need to build, it could take 1 to 2 months to complete, to actually build that pad and the road and get it ready for a rig to move on site. Obviously for a flat location that's right next to an existing road might take less time. If it's in a hilly, mountainous terrain with long access road, it could take a lot longer, but just in general, 1 to 2 months. So the next step after that, you have the rig moving to the pad. This is always an exciting time. This is when people start to really take notice of the fact that a well is being drilled in their area. So you have the rig move to the pad. They have to set up, place any sort of sound barriers in place, whatever the local requirements are. They got to make sure that they put that in place. And so that's done. That takes a few days. And then what they start to do when they do start to turn to the right, as they say, or start drilling, they'll drill the surface casing first. And so they'll drill that surface hole, which is a little bit larger diameter, and they'll drill that down below the lowest aquifer level. What they'll do then is stop work. They'll trip the bit out of the hole or pull it out of the hole, and then they'll insert casing into place and cement it to protect those aquifer layers. And so they do this by lowering the casing pipe, each joint of pipe, and connecting it, and then keep pushing it down until it's all the way down to that bottom of that surface casing level that they have in that wellbore design. And then they'll start pumping cement down the entire length until it circulates up the backside and seals off the space between the casing string and the wellbore. And the reason they do that is to ensure that as they go and complete the well down at lower levels in the actual pay zones, that you don't have oil and gas accidentally migrating up behind the backside of that pipe in the casing and in contaminating any drinking water. So what they do, there's specific requirements. Each state, it varies from state to state, but steps in place that they have to verify that they have good, they call wellbore integrity, and that surface casing is got good cement job in between it and the wellbore, so that doesn't get contaminated. So that's the kind of the first big step. That can sometimes be done with a smaller rig. So they may do the vertical section with a small sort of top hole rig, and then bring in a bigger rig to do the horizontal section, or it could be done with just one rig. Either way, it usually takes nowadays around 1 to 2 weeks to drill each well. And again, this is sort of if you imagine a development scenario, so they have a bunch of other wells in that area. They know the geology. They've got the drilling down pat, so to speak. There's no experimental stuff they're doing. They're not taking core samples. any of those extra steps, if they do any sort of science work or, if they're drilling core, if this is an exploration well, you could probably double that time. Just they're going to be a lot more cautious and try to understand the geology. And so they'll be taking some samples and things like that. And that'll take a little bit longer versus in the production mode where they're just, they hear that drill, baby, drill. That's what they're doing. They're looking at how can we be as efficient and effective as possible to get the well done quickly, within the regulations and within the well design. So they also, just another thing, they may drill multiple wells in order to do that in kind of a batch operation. So they may drill one, move the rig over a few feet, drill the next one, move it over a few feet, drill the next one, and so on to whatever number of wells they have in the plan. And then they may just drill one well to hold the lease. So it just depends on the situation. So that can dictate as well how long it'll take before you can start to see a check. So if they're drilling a bunch of wells, you figure 1 to 2 weeks per well, plus a day or two in between each one to set up and skid over or to move over. And so that'll dictate sort of how long the overall drilling operation takes. Drilling a well, that's what happens at a high level and how long it takes. And then at the end, they have a couple of days for moving the rig off the pad and then cleaning up the pad to get ready to bring the frac crew on. Justin, do you know what happens when they complete a well, when they hear completions or fracking?
I know that it is filed with the state, and they move on to actually fracking the well, but I don't know much more than that.
Yeah, so sometimes you'll hear, completions or fracking, and those are sort of interchangeable words. Generally, what they do, completion is when they have a drilled well and they're going to come in and take the steps necessary to get it ready so that it can produce oil or gas. That is things like perforating and fracking. You'll hear fracking is a very big buzzword, obviously, in the news. And what the technical term for that is hydraulic fracturing. And when they go and frack a well or complete a well, it could be, a couple of days to a few weeks after the well is drilled to when they come in, in an ideal situation. Or, what you may have heard recently is DUC, or drilled uncompleted wells. And so they may have a backlog of wells that have been drilled, and maybe they're looking to turn on production. They're trying to spend as much money at the end of the year to drill. They don't have enough to complete, or completion crews aren't available for a few months. So those wells may actually sit for some time before they're completed. So again, this is, we're talking sort of ideal situation, step by step, best case scenario, and the timing associated with that. But just know that it could be, depending on commodity price, if the bottom falls out of the commodity prices, it may be in their best interest to wait until prices recover before they start producing, because most of the production they're going to get out of those wells is going to occur in the first few months. And so they want to make sure that they're not shooting themselves in the foot, so to speak, by going ahead after price of oil falls really low, complete it, and then all of a sudden, they're not going to break even on that well because the oil price is too low. So that could be something that could happen. Just know that that's a possibility. But if you are going to go in and they're going to complete, what they do is they have a specific design that goes into that completion job. And there's a completion engineer that'll work with the service company representatives to design how it's going to be done in terms of how many frac stages, the volume of water, any additives, the proppant type and amount. And what they'll do is they'll look at data from recently completed wells in the area to try to optimize that. And so if another operator nearby is really jacked up their frac density and using a lot more proppant and stuff like that, they'll say, and they got good results. They'll say, let's try that on this next well. So let's look at how we optimize our design, given the geology, given all the factors that they know. And they'll go into to say, okay, this is the plan, step by step, what we're going to do to complete that well. And you hear a lot about chemicals being injected, and people are a lot of times worried about what they're injecting down hole and is it going to contaminate the groundwater. just know that the majority of the chemicals are food grade additives. So, a thing like guar gum is a really common additive, and that's in a lot of the foods we eat. And the whole purpose of that, what they add the chemicals for, is to do things like kill any nasty bacteria that might create hydrogen sulfide in the reservoir. So they might have some biocides that they put in there that are really just to kill any sort of aggressive bacteria. And then the other thing is they want to gel that water and suspend the sand in the water so it actually gets delivered to the formation, because the whole purpose of pumping sand down there is to keep the fractures that they create open. So hold those open. They're called proppant, or it's really sand is what they're pumping down there, but it's to prop those cracks open so that oil and gas can flow through the cracks to the wellbore and up, and so they can produce it. So the steps that they'll take to do the frack job is they'll mobilize and set up the frack equipment. So this includes things like high pressure pumps, mixers, blenders, lots of frack tanks, water tanks, basically. And so it is a very water intensive activity. And what they'll do is each well, they will decide how many stages. And so they'll go in and frack a well. Take 4 to 5 days per well, typically, again, depending on the design and the location. But just to say in general, let's say 4 to 5 days per well. They'll go in and insert a tool down that has actual explosive charges on it that will perforate the wellbore in a specific location. And then they'll pump high pressure water in the sand and all the other stuff down. And that will go flow through those perforations that they created in the wellbore into the rock, and then crack the rock and actually frack it. So that's what they call the fracturing or cracking of the rock. And that occurs a certain radius around the wellbore, typically horizontally, as that's the plane of the kind of the weakest strength. And so that primarily will go horizontally through the shale layer, through the target layer, and then they will do that step by step in each of along the wellbore in the target formation that they want to complete. So they may do multiple stages, 20 or 30 of these individual stages, and they will place a plug or something in between each stage so that they can target the high pressure water and sand into the specific zone that they want for each frac. When they're done with that, they will drill out those plugs, remove them, and then start to flow that well back. And generally speaking, what they'll do is they'll try to, it'll be a higher pressure downhole. It should flow back through the lower pressure at the surface. And they're going to get a lot of that frac sand and water back initially. So they'll put temporary equipment in place and produce through that temporary equipment for a period of time until the rates drop back down to where there's less sand that's going to cause erosion within the permanent facilities and any piping or separators, et cetera. So then they'll they'll turn it over to the permanent facilities. So just in general, again, you have that 4 to 5 days per well to frack a well, time on the back end to demobilize that crew and all that equipment to move it to the next location, and to clean up the well pad and put on any temporary equipment, connect the wells, and then start flowing. Again, we talked back to that at the beginning, the parallel path that we took with the drilling and completions to where the surface facilities and pipelines were being built. A lot of times some of the surface equipment will be pre-placed on the pad, and all they have to do at the end is just make the final tie-ins, and that's in an ideal situation to minimize the downtime after they complete the well to when actually they're selling oil and gas. But again, if we're talking the need to build lengthy pipeline routes or to get land clearances and right of way for those pipelines, it could take a lot longer. And there may be some downtime between when the well is completed to when they actually can tie in those equipment and start flowing. So that is, in a nutshell, the life cycle of a typical oil and gas well in unconventionals. Sort of at that point, you have a producing well pad or producing well, and things are looking up. So the next step, so if we talk about the best case scenario, just to recap what I just talked about, there were about 4 to 8 weeks to build the well pad and the roads. And for the purposes of discussion for here, we'll assume that they installed the flow lines and gathering pipeline connectors at the same time and just ready to make the final tie-ins to each well once they're drilled and completed. And also typically what's done in these scenarios where they're in the development mode and they're drilling a bunch of wells in an area is they'll be prefabricating the surface equipment and just all they need to do is set it on the well pad, build the foundations and set it. And that reduces that the surface kit construction time. And that helps with this overall timeline. And so in this case, we'll assume that is the case. And then if they drill one well, let's say, maybe 3 weeks. Again, that's for a few days either side of moving the rig in and out, and then about 2 weeks to drill the actual well. And then again, for the completions, same scenario, takes a few days to bring on the equipment, and then 4 to 5 days to frack. So at the end of the day, it's about a 2-week time period to complete. And if the well doesn't flow on its own, another thing I'll mention is a lot of times they do have to place equipment for each well. So artificial lift, they call it. And this is like a beam pump or a pump jack you'll see in the oil field where they'll be actually installing that equipment. And that may take another couple of weeks to do that final equipment installation. And that may be after the well flows back and actually once the pressures come back down and they need to put it on artificial lift. But at the end of the day, when you add up all of those number of days for each of those steps, it's typically about 10 to 15 weeks to get that stuff done. And so that's about, say, 2.5 to 4 months. So if you have wells that are permitted on your property and they start work on building the well pad and assuming they're going to continue that work without interruption through each of these steps, the typical timeline, again, best case would be in that 3 to 4 month time period, you'll start to see some activity in terms of that well producing oil and gas. Talk a little bit about after the well is finished and what are the kind of administrative things that the operators need to do and some of the statutory requirements. And we'll talk about Texas in specific example to give you some data points. But just what happens after they do the work and the well comes online, or in other words, it's starting to produce oil and gas. There's some other stuff that needs to go on. And so, Justin, in your experience, division orders, I assume you've gotten a few of those in your day?
Yeah, absolutely. Division orders are a great thing to see, and it's a part of life. I've also seen pooling agreements and unitization agreements, which is something that you will see at times where they're trying to develop the land and get ready to drill.
Yeah, and if you start to hear about people getting division orders in your area, or you get one in the mail, that means that that production is imminent or has occurred, and you're going to start getting royalty checks soon. There's some timelines associated with that, and typically what they do once they know that well is going to be successful, they'll do a division order title opinion. So at the beginning, we talked about title clearance. Is what they do is actually a drilling title opinion. And what that purpose of that is to understand and to verify that they have the right to go in and drill a well. So they're not going to be trespassing, and that they know kind of the percentages for each owner and so forth. And then when they actually know that the well is going to produce oil and gas, they do kind of a double check or a division order title opinion. And that's to tell the company who they need to pay the royalties to and in what specific percentage. And what that'll list is each owner that has an interest in production in those wells and that owner's corresponding decimal interest. And all of that must add up to 100%. And if you don't know what a division order is, or if you want to find out more, we actually have a full episode on division orders and all you need to know there. So check that out, mineralrightspodcast.com or wherever you find your podcasts. And so that's a little bit of background here. We won't go into detail. And the other thing to know is if there are title issues, in the division order title opinion will list them out and then what needs to happen in order to cure that. And typically, as a royalty owner, you won't get paid until those issues are fixed. And so what'll happen there is your interest will be placed in what they call suspense. So they'll basically be accumulating your revenue generated from that well until you can demonstrate that you have marketable title and that you are the one that should be getting those payments. And they do that to protect themselves as well, so they're not paying the wrong owner. And so that's why that might occur. And Justin, in your experience, what have you had to do in order to start getting paid when you've, let's say, inherited some minerals that maybe had some title issues? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, the most common, I think definitely is the oil companies will ask you to file a deed with the county. And anytime that's going on, they want to talk about it once the document has been filed with the county, and you can provide that back to them. I've also seen alpha-dated heirship is pretty common, or even sometimes probating a will in a certain county if that's going to be required.
Yeah, so all of that stuff. And again, if you don't know what to do, just ask. If you just contact the division order analyst within the company, they'll tell you exactly what needs to happen in order for you to start getting paid. So they'll say, here's what the division order title opinion says. We need to, like Justin said, we need to have a recorded copy of a deed in order to start to put that into pay status. So this is what we'll need from you. And so they'll, if you don't know what to do, just ask them. They'll tell you. And sometimes it may involve hiring an attorney in that county to, like Justin said, maybe go through ancillary probate, or to create a deed and have that executed so that you can record it and then show up as the new owner of record for those minerals. So a few steps might be required before you start getting a check if there are title issues. If there aren't, you'll get that division order, and there's some steps that you need to take in order to make sure that it's correct and to sign it and send it back, and timeframes associated with that. And again, go to our episode on division orders to find out more. And then the last step everybody likes to hear is they start paying the mineral owners. So that's when you'll get the checks start coming in, or direct deposit if you've elected to do that. So Justin, you have minerals in Texas. What do you know about Texas requirements and timeframes in which operators have to pay royalty owners?
I know one of the biggest ones, and of course I'm most familiar with this, is 120 days after the end of the month, the first sell is when they're supposed to start paying royalties owners. And there are certain things that can hold that up depending on what's going on for them. I've been in several scenarios where they had some unforeseen circumstances kind of going on. Ongoing payment 60 days after the end of the calendar month in which oil production is sold, it's supposed to be paid. And then 90 days after the end of the calendar month in which gas production is sold, you're supposed to be paid. And I think a lot of people don't realize that those two are actually separate. And I've actually ran into issues where it confused me, and I had to contact the operator and find out what was going on there. Payments must be made when the payment reaches $100 or more. If payments do not reach $100 within 12 months and are greater than $10, the aggregated amount must be paid once yearly. Amounts that do not aggregate to $10 must be paid upon the sale or the plugging of the property, or at the owner's request. And I see a lot of times people find out that they inherited minerals through sometimes seeing that the money was cheated to the state and looking at unclaimed funds. If an owner requests a payment more frequently, the amount only has to aggregate to $25, and that's at the election of the owner in written request.
Yeah, and the thing that really is important here is we talk about that first check, is that first sale. So this is not the date of first production. So it may take a month. They may produce the well into tanks on the well pad, then we'll kind of reach a certain amount of oil that's produced, then they'll sell it, and it may get trucked off or go into the pipeline. And so just depending on when they actually first sell the oil and gas, that's when the clock starts ticking. And it's actually not from the date of first production. So it may be a month or so, or even more, I guess. And if it's not a big producer, before they actually make the first sale from that well. And that's again, when that clock starts ticking in Texas, at least. And then just as, once you've received ongoing production, you'll start to see those steady royalty checks, hopefully, if it's a good well. And just know that there are things that can disrupt that. One of the things that can happen is they'll be monitoring the production. And if it starts to drop for some reason, they may need to go in and do a well intervention. And so that may require going in and doing an acid job, or cleaning up the well bore if there's paraffin that's building up. things like that they might need to do, or pull rods. That's pretty typical that. And so they may periodically need to go in and do a workover of that well. And when that workover is going on, they'll shut in the well. At that point, they won't be producing oil and gas, and therefore you won't be getting paid royalties on those days that it's shut in. Typically, though, on the bright side, once they do restore production, you get what they call flush production max. So it'll kind of restore, it'll come back at a higher rate and then drop back down to kind of where hopefully it was expected to produce before they had that disruption. And so you'll kind of get a big bump after that. Again, if there's flush production, but that is something that they monitor on an ongoing basis. They call production engineers that look at all the wells in their area, make sure all of those are optimized and producing as efficiently and effectively as possible. And then just to add on to what Justin said about royalty questions, there's a couple of things that you need to know about making requests in writing. And that's always a kind of a best practice in contacting an operator about something related to your royalty checks. So that can be done via email, as an example, or by certified mail. If you're really wanting to cross your T's and dot your I's. And then operators must respond within a certain time frame. And again, for Texas, if you notify, let's say you stop getting paid, you go to the Railroad Commission's website and you see that they're still reporting production to the state, but you haven't received royalty payments, after the 60 or 90-day period, like Justin mentioned, you need to notify them in writing of their failure to make timely payment. And then they either have to make the payment to you or respond in writing within 30 days of receipt of your written notice. So that's to protect royalty owners. And similarly, if you have a request for information, they have to reply to that. So if you start to see your deductions go up, and this is where you got to stay on top of it, just because you start getting royalty checks doesn't mean you can just sit back and forget about it. You need to review those check stubs each month and make sure that those deductions aren't creeping up and they're not deducting something they're not allowed to and under the terms of the lease. And if you want to find out more, you can ask for more detail around those deductions that are being made on a monthly basis. If they bump up, they have to let you know or respond at least to your inquiry within 60 days of receipt of your request. And so that's again to protect royalty owners, and just know that you have some of those protections in place. Again, those are for Texas specifically. Other states may have different timeframes. Just check your state oil and gas commission website if you have questions.
Absolutely. And, there are some common questions that kind of revolve around this that I'd love to throw at you, Matt, and see if you can give an answer to some of our listeners if they may have the same question.
Okay.
One of the most common I hear all the time is that I see multiple permits in my tract of land. Does this eventually mean that many wells will be drilled, or what is the thinking from the oil company when they go out and they file several permits in an area?
Yeah, and I'd say the answer there is it depends. It could be that they are going to permit those wells, but they may not drill them all at the same time. So eventually they may drill that number of wells, because typically the state will have sort of the well spacing requirements with the Oil and Gas Commission or the Railroad Commission outline. So it'll outline the maximum number of wells per certain area of land that can be drilled in that formation specifically. And so what they may do is they may permit all of those wells at one time and then come in over in phases and actually drill them. So just because they're permitted doesn't mean that they will all get drilled at once. Could be that they permit those wells, they only go in and drill one well to hold the lease and then move to the next area, do the same. And this is where they maybe have some things that kind of play into this, and they may have lease expiry that's coming up and they need to drill a well in order to hold the lease so they don't have to go back and release it or pay lease bonuses again. And so they'll just look at it on a case-by-case basis. And if they have that issue, that could mean that only one well gets drilled before they move on to the next one, because they've then secured it's held by production. They can take their time. They can always go in and renew the permits or let them expire and re-permit them down the road. So just because it's permitted doesn't always mean that it's going to get drilled.
And one thing I hear quite often, and this is becoming more common, I think, especially with horizontals, but you hear about operators talking about drilling multiple times from a single pad. What is this and why is this done?
Yeah, and this, kind of goes back to that first question is if they do only drill one well to hold production, or maybe they do a set of 3 or 4 wells to do a spacing trial, let's say, to increase density, and they want to understand what the optimum well spacing is in that specific area, they may drill a few wells, see what the response is, how much production they get back, and check their reservoir models and make sure that they're getting what they expected. And if they do that kind of work, then if everything's successful, and they'll come back later and drill the rest of those wells. And again, there's other areas. I know I used to work for a company that operated in Pinedale, Wyoming, and in that case, they had wildlife stipulations that would kick in. So there was some sort of time frames involved with how long they could actually be there to drill a well before they had to move equipment off to allow wildlife migration and other things, so they weren't disrupting the wildlife in the area. And so in that case, they actually, I know, had plans to go in. They would drill initial batch of wells, and then they'd have to move off and then come back the next year maybe to come and finish out that well pad. And so that's why it's done. Is generally if they have other priorities that they're looking at, they may drill only a few wells at a time and then come back and drill the rest if things look good. Or it could just be, the other thing too is there's infrastructure constraints. So they may only be able to drill half the wells initially to not back all of those up with maybe gas pipeline that has high line pressures. And so if they were to drill all of them and complete them all, they just frankly wouldn't it wouldn't make sense, because there just wouldn't be the capacity to take away the gas, for example. So it could be that they want to complete those initial set of wells, let the production drop down to manageable level, and then come in and drill the rest. And so that they're balancing all these factors that they've taken into account. And so it's a kind of a complicated thing, a lot of moving parts that go into deciding where to drill, when to do it. And that's why it's done.
Absolutely. And to that effect as well, I mean, it's an ever-changing economic situation. And, a small thing can affect what oil companies are doing and the decisions that they're going to make down the road in the next few months. Kind of on this effect, and at the other end of the life cycle of a well, the operator has told me that they have plans to shut in the oil well. Why would an operator do this?
Yeah, and this goes back to that well intervention scenario that I mentioned. It could be that they're having some operational issues with the well. It could be a temporary thing, or it could be a permanent thing. That's where you'd want to find out exactly what is going on. Just ask them, is this something you're going to shut in permanently and then plug and abandon this well, or is this just a temporary thing? What are your plans for the well? So they shut it in. Or it could be that the well's at the end of its life, and they think that it's pretty well done, and they're going to shut it and then eventually plug and abandon it. This can also be done in an area like in the DJ Basin, for example, where they've drilled initial vertical wells into the Niobrara. They produce those for a while, and those are holding the lease. And then the operator has plans to come back. Maybe they've permitted some horizontal wells in that area. And before they go and complete those wells, the new horizontal wells, they'll typically shut in the old vertical wells and P&A them.
And this is a kind of a different take on a question that I think a lot of people ask, but pooling and unitization agreements, though they have an effect on mineral right owners, what is the purpose for an operator? What does it serve for the operator? And on a really high level, how does it affect the mineral right owner's land?
Yeah, and this is a hot topic. We actually covered forced pooling and kind of what is pooling in a couple of separate episodes. So again, go to mineralrightspodcast.com or go back to in iTunes or Google Play or wherever you're listening to this, and you can find those episodes, and we cover it in a lot more detail. But just at a high level, the effect that it has on mineral owners is that your tract of land is combined with other land nearby to form a unit, or they typically call either, they do a unitization agreement and they'll actually unitize, or it'll be through a pooling agreement. And what they do that, it basically allows your minerals to be in the production from the wells in that unit be commingled, and you'll get your fractional interest within that unit. And so the reason they do that is a lot of times, especially with these longer horizontal wells, you're talking could be 2 sections of land or 1,280 acres per unit. And so they need to be able to pool those minerals together in order to drill those long horizontal wells and to be able to produce them. And if you didn't have the ability to do that, it could mean that you have 1,279 acres leased up and you have one reluctant mineral owner that doesn't want to sign a lease, and they're going to hold up the rest of the development. So what it allows for is preventing waste within the production. So they set sort of the maximum number of wells that can be drilled within that unit, and then it allows for efficient development of that unit by the operator so that you can actually develop the minerals. Again, otherwise you'd have people holding out and stopping any development from occurring if they didn't have the rights under those agreements.
And this is a bit on the same topic, but I was seeking someone to lease my property, and the company that I approached said that they didn't have any leasehold in the area. What does this mean?
So this may be where someone is active in a basin, but in that specific area where your minerals are, they're not they don't have any active leasehold. In other words, they don't have any leases that are in that area. They may be focused on another part of that basin. Not to say that they might not lease your land and get in, get their foot in the door in that area, but just that's what that would mean is they just don't have leases in that area. Maybe their focus has been in other areas. And typically what you'll hear is an operator they wanted to get contiguous acres, and so that they can have a majority interest in a unit, and then be the operator and actually get the majority of the revenue from that well or wells that they drill.
And I think this is a common question, a really common question with a very simple answer. But I've received a royalty check, but the information from when I check the commission is incorrect, or there isn't any information at all so far.
Yeah, it's pretty common if you have a new well that you won't have information maybe reported to the Oil and Gas Commission. It might not show up on their website yet. Or it could be that the operator is actually a little bit lax in reporting that production data to the state. If you say, hey, I noticed that I'm getting this check, or I'm not seeing production on the state Oil and Gas Commission website, what's going on with the state? But again, a lot of times it's just that initial timing from when you get the division order, you get the royalty check, and then production might be lagging, at least that initial reporting, and then it'll start showing up. Again, it depends on when they sell it. So that's when the really becomes interesting and important, is when the sale, the volumes that you're looking at. And when you compare your royalty check, if you think information is incorrect, make sure you look at the sales information on the Oil and Gas Commission, because they'll report the production that occurred for that month, but that may be different than the sales. And what the check stub will actually be based on is the actual oil and gas sales for that month. And so if there's a difference there may be actually, there's some oil still in the tank on the lease site. And so, it'll show up in the next month's royalty check when they sell that oil. So that's why there might be a difference. But if you are looking at the actual sales information on your check stub and the sales information on the Oil and Gas Commission, and there's a difference, then that's where you would need to contact the operator and ask what's going on. And again, do that in writing. Like we talked about, there's certain protections in place. Again, varies by state, but just make sure you don't let it go. Could be an oversight on their part, on their accounting system. Something could be wrong.
And last but not least, a question with that not such a simple answer, but I've received a division order, but haven't received a check for several months. Did something happen?
This is pretty common where you get a division order, you haven't gotten a check. It's typically because, like we talked about, within those timeframes, it could be that the well production has started, but maybe they haven't started selling oil and gas yet, and then the timeline will kick in. And so it could be, again, like we talked about, up to 120 days after first sales before that initial payment gets made. So just because you get a division order doesn't mean you'll see a check show up right away. Could be several months before that happens, and that's pretty common. Another thing that I've run into is where I had an interest in some oil and gas wells that were sold to another company. And it took several months before I got new division orders and got checks coming again. And, if it's in suspense, if that happens and they're needing to transfer those assets to another accounting system and all that, you're going to eventually get paid on those monies, but you make sure that you're one of the first royalty owners that gets your check. You might want to bug them, especially if it's been several months since you've expected to hear something.
Absolutely. And, I think this is another really common one. And the last question I have for you, Matt, but the oil well was doing great in the beginning. It was producing and paying out great. And then all of a sudden it just decided to quit paying.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say in general, so especially with these unconventional wells, you will see great production at the very beginning. So you have a couple of months where the production rates will be really high, and then they'll start to rapidly decline. And that's very common. These unconventional wells have a very steep decline rate. So what that means is the initial first few months, you'll get a lot of production, and then it'll start to go down very quickly before it sort of settles at a lower rate. And then it will continue kind of asymptotically, or, in other words, it'll keep going down slightly over, month to month, but it'll sort of steady out to a kind of a more consistent payment that you'll get. And so that's pretty common. If it does stop, again, it goes back to the stuff we already talked about. It could be they shut in the well for some reason. Again, just contact the operator and ask what's going on, and they'll usually tell you.
I think that covers most of my common questions.
All right, thanks. And again, this was a sort of an overview of the oil and gas well life cycle and how long before you start receiving royalties in a typical kind of best case scenario. Again, it could be longer or shorter, just depending on your specific location. But just to give you some feel for all of the things that go in, and this is, at a high level, it's just a very complex and interesting business. And there's definitely timelines that are required for each step to do it right. And so if you have a reputable operator and that's not going to cut corners, it's going to take time. And this is good because hopefully they're doing this for the long haul, and they're going to be in the game for a long time. And you can partner with them and be kind of know what to expect when it comes to being able to get royalty checks from the operator. So again, thanks again for tuning into this episode of the Mineral Rights Podcast. If you have any feedback for us, you can send an email at feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Check out the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com. And please leave us a rating and review on iTunes or wherever you are listening to this podcast. If you would like to help us out, that's the biggest thing that can be done. It takes about a minute and will help make sure that we are reaching all other mineral owners that need to hear this information. Thanks again for listening. Again, I'm your host, Matt Sands, signing off. Thanks again, Justin.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.